Well, thank you all for coming back after the coffee break, and we hope to reward you for your presence with a very interesting panel on the effects of outcomes-based financing and contracting here in California. I am Jessica LaBarbera. I'm a vice president at Nonprofit Finance Fund, where I oversee our organization's strategic initiatives with government and foundation partners on outcomes-oriented initiatives. And I am thrilled to have with me today government and nonprofit leaders who are really trailblazing doers in this outcome space. These are folks that we've met through the California Pay for Success initiative that Don mentioned is a collaboration that NFF has done with the James Irvine Foundation for the last 4 years that has led to the first Pay for Success projects in California, but in some ways, as if not more importantly, has supported the shift to outcomes in our governments and our nonprofit leaders across the state. So I'm thrilled to have these folks with us today to talk about their experiences, to share their perspective on what works, and to really hone in on how these transitions that we're talking about today affect the people that are served by the social programs at the heart of our outcomes focus. So to give you a sort of overview of some of the major themes we'll be touching on today, I'll start by reiterating a point that's been made a few times today, which is that none of this innovative work is being done simply for the sake of innovation. It bears repeating, particularly to those of you who came back after the break and are thus even more engaged and interested in this work than others, perhaps, that this isn't just about how exciting the new financial transaction is or how exciting the new way of work is, but it really bears repeating that this is about the communities that we serve. And these three panelists are going to illuminate how that's happening for the community members, for governments, and for nonprofits. So happy to be able to get onto the real sort of boots on the ground perspective here. The outcomes work of our panelists began with exploration of Pay for Success, but you'll see that those pursuits have, more than any one particular project, served to build a much-needed outcomes muscle and to address infrastructure improvements in governments and service providers' capacity to measure results, expand programs that work, and work differently and in more collaborative and challenging ways, admittedly, in partnership between and within these organizations. The last point that you'll hear us all touch on is that developing an outcomes orientation is a journey. All of these leaders are building upon their early lessons learned in their doing of innovation thus far, but this is a continuously evolving approach. And as such, it requires continuous resources and investment of funds, effort, people, time, energy, patience, all of that. So without further ado, I want to have our panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll talk a little bit about the projects and the processes of their work. So Kavita, let's start with you.
My name is Kavita. Am I mic'd? All right, there I go. My name is Kavita Narayan. I'm a deputy county counsel with the County of Santa Clara, and I work for a team in the county counsel's office that's a bit of a unique team. It's called the Impact Litigation and Social Justice Unit. And in addition to the litigation piece of that work, the other half of essentially our docket or our mission within the county counsel's office is to work on policy projects that the sole focus of which is to have an impact on county residents and to come up with unique solutions for making change, the kind of change that we want to see as a government organization. The County of Santa Clara, as Don Howard alluded to earlier, has launched 2 Pay for Success projects. The first in 2015 called Project Welcome Home, that I'm sure Louis will touch on a bit more as our service provider partner in that project, has to do with reducing chronic homelessness using a housing first approach. The second project that we launched just as of January 1st of this year is, we believe, the first mental health focused Pay for Success project in the country that's aimed at reducing the contacts by really severely mentally ill county residents with the psychiatric emergency room and with other inpatient involuntary settings by moving away from kind of episodic and reactive care where you treat people when they come into the ER, and instead focusing in a more holistic way on stabilizing them in an outpatient community-based setting so that they're not bouncing in and out of really expensive and ultimately ineffective care settings.
Great. Saidah.
Good afternoon. My name is Saidah Leatutufu, and I serve as the Economic Mobility Director for Hope SF. for the city and county in San Francisco. And Hope SF, as many of you have heard earlier, Fred Blackwell talk about, is a large-scale housing and reparations initiative aimed at reducing social isolation, disrupting intergenerational poverty, and creating vibrant mixed-income communities without mass displacement. And as Economic Mobility Director, my primary role is to connect Hope SF residents, former public housing residents, to the wealth and resource-rich city that San Francisco is, and making sure that they have that opportunity and access to that wealth. What I'll be speaking a little bit about today is the Phoenix Project, which is an outcomes-based contract that we, the city, have partnered with our philanthropic partners to support a collaborative of seven organizations in the Southeast sector here in San Francisco to work with transitional age youth and connect them to durable career pathways.
Thanks, Saidah.
Great. Louis Chicoine, Executive Director of Abode Services. We're headquartered in Fremont, California, across the Bay. And I've been with the organization for over 24 years now. When I started, the organization was had a budget of $400,000. And now we just passed a budget of $55 million. And we have rehoused, but the number that matters is that in the last 7 years alone, we've rehoused over 6,200 local Bay Area homeless people. And so we have, I think our story, and I hope we have a chance to say a little bit more about this, but our story is really about going from a very traditional shelter model to a housing first approach and dragging everyone, including funders, with us.
Fabulous. I told you we have the trailblazing doers here, and they've set the stage for some great stories. So Kavita, let's dive in a little bit further with you. Just a few years ago, we started to talk about pursuing pay for success in the county, and this was the big, exciting thing. And not to say that it's not anymore, but I think Santa Clara's journey with pay for success really exemplifies how you all have led in exploring a new way to contract with and work with providers. And Louis, will be great to get your perspective on this as well. And you have now, a few years since the launch of your first project, moved to a place where you're saving the best of pay for success and also thinking about how can we take these lessons and incorporate them more generally into our social spending on outcomes. So I'd love to just hear a little bit about that journey from the county's perspective.
Sure. So even within our two formally launched Pay for Success projects, there are some evolutions and some differences that we arrived at from the time of the first project focused on chronic homelessness to the second project focusing on mental health services. And the biggest of those in terms of project structuring is that the county's second Pay for Success project does not use any private investments. It's all funded entirely by the county with a lot of skin in the game by our service provider. And there were a number of reasons that the County of Santa Clara opted to structure the second project in that way. One of the big ones honestly had to do with the time involved in project structuring when there's funders and multiple other essentially people at the table as part of the decision-making process. But really the bigger reason was around creating a relationship between government and service providers where the incentives around outcomes-based contracting and around encouraging good performance are sort of baked into the entire contracting structure, where there's just a contract between government and the service provider, but instead of being a fee-for-service traditional government service contract, it's a contract where, in the case of our mental health project, $1.4 million out of a total PFS project budget of $11 million, after setting aside Medi-Cal reimbursements and other revenues, is contingent, is outcomes-based. And that's a pretty big amount of money for a service provider that is traditionally receiving fee-for-service, to have the outlay for them at the beginning of the startup costs involved in putting together a project like this that took a year to get off the ground from the time we started negotiating and having selected the service provider to the time we launched the project. And then I think, we may touch on this later, but I can get into some of the ways in which our county has used the concepts of pay for success in non-pay for success settings. We have currently operating in our county projects running the gamut from the two formal pay for success projects I just described to more of a pay for performance model, and that was discussed earlier in a couple of settings. We currently have a contract with the Center for Employment Opportunities to provide employment services to our moderate to high risk older adult probationers. That contract doesn't involve outside investments, doesn't involve a third-party evaluator, but does involve focusing not just on how many hours of job readiness training are you providing, but instead how many people are stably employed after 30, 90, 180, even farther out than that. Moving kind of down the spectrum from there, we're also applying some of the outcomes-based theories of pay for success in other settings. I've been part for the last 3 years of a really holistic effort at our county to engage in pretrial and bail reform, looking really broadly at the ways in which decision-making around when someone is either ordered to pay money bail in order to be released from jail or obtain other forms of pretrial release. What are the far-reaching consequences of those decisions for people? We're thinking about doing things in our county like starting up a community bail fund where a community organization would run essentially a cash bail fund where people who are indigent, who have bail set at a low amount, say under $2,000, and who have, say, only misdemeanor offenses. You can kind of set the criteria however you want. Can go to this, these are people who might not be able to afford a bail bond. They can go to this community bail fund, have it post cash bail for them. As long as they make all of their appearances throughout the life of their criminal case, the money is refunded and then recycled back into the fund for other people to use. What we're trying to do in that project is not build a formal pay for success deal, but instead to think about what's the status quo of outcomes that we're seeing for pretrial criminal defendants? How long does it take for cases to be processed such that people who are booked into jail can actually get out, whether it's on bail or another form of release? What's the base rate of failing to appear in court, which can lead to bench warrants and other criminal consequences? What's the rate at which people who are on pretrial release are engaging in new criminal activity? And then we want our provider with whom we contract for this community bail fund to do better, to reduce those recidivism rates, the failure to appear rates, to reduce processing time out of jail. So that's not really a pay for success contract, but it's very outcomes based.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kavita. I think just listening to you, it's clear how much this outcomes orientation has started to influence the way that the county is working and thinking about your social programs. Can you tell us just a little bit about the cultural shift that's happened within the county, both within the Board of Supervisors and within, line staff who have been administering these changes? How have you gotten from a place where you got a yes to the state's first Pay for Success project to a place where this type of thinking is influencing so many of your programs?
Sure. So I think there are a number of county department heads and also line level staff who may not be familiar with the concept of pay for success, probably will never work on a pay for success project through the time in their employment in the county, but are part of the more holistic effort with our county to move towards data-driven, outcomes-based contracting and not just paying providers for the same services they've always provided for the sole reason that we have always done so. And I think the drivers of that cultural shift within Santa Clara County have been all through the spectrum from the leadership level of our Board of Supervisors and our county executive, our chief operating officer, down through the individual department heads who have been working with their staff to understand the importance of starting out a project by looking at who is the target population that we're trying to serve. I mean, we're the 6th largest county in the state. We have a budget of $6 billion a year. We have 1.9 million residents. We're a huge organization with a huge responsibility to the people who live in our county. So what's the population that we're trying to serve? Do we have the ability to study right now the outcomes that are being achieved for those people? And if not, why not? What are some of the barriers around the data systems that we have in place, or around other kind of cultural reasons that we may not be understanding kind of the current status of our population? And I think as people have started to see the benefits of working with our providers in partnerships to kind of better understand the population, where they are now, where they could be, and what they need to get there. It's been kind of an organic shift at the staff level in seeing really the benefit for their clients on the ground. So in particular with the county departments that are the more public-facing departments like probation, where you have probation officers regularly working with clients to ensure that they successfully complete probation. Well, you can do a much better job when the services that you're contracting for are actually getting people stably employed, or are ensuring that they have stable housing and the other things that they need to succeed in completing their probation. So I feel like it's been partly direction from the leadership, partly just an organic shift at the staff level as they've seen the benefits of this approach.
Great, thank you. Louis, I'm curious your perspective. Tell us a little bit about how Project Welcome Home, the first Pay for Success project, is doing. And would also love to hear a little bit more about how participating in the project has changed what it's meant for Abode and what it's meant for the people that you're serving.
Great. So we're at the 2-year mark of a 6-year project, and I need to set a little context quickly. The county and Kavita did a great job of describing the thinking, and so the county wanted to impact this massive problem of homelessness. There's, on any given night, 6,000 individuals who are homeless on the streets in Santa Clara County, and there's a great desire to impact that problem with interventions at work. Their first step was to begin to house folks through a massive investment of general funds to combine with other leverage sources. And then when it came to Pay for Success, they wanted to drill down on really proving that this Housing First was doing what they thought it was doing by doing an economic study initially to determine the cost of the most chronic individuals in the county to the county related to their utilization of services. And at the top percentile, the top fifth, the average cost they found through this extensive study was around an average of $84,000 per person per year. Basically to do nothing but to receive those folks into their high cost services, ER, police and fire, psych ward, and so forth. So 84,000. And then from there, there's a lot of other steps, but basically the concept was then to spend the dollars necessary to change that dynamic by putting those folks into housing. So the project that we applied and were selected to implement, Project Welcome Home, takes 115 of the most chronic homeless folks and places them in housing with wraparound services to keep them in that housing. And there are investors in the project that pay the upfront costs to do that intervention, and then they receive a payment back plus what's called a success payment once the success metric has been met, which is related to the amount of time people are housed. So to make a long story short, I want to show you something. Graphics are always very helpful. So I'll do a Vanna White here. And this chart is a demonstration of what happened when the first referrals came into the program. So the negative numbers relate to months without housing. 0 is the first day an individual is housed. And these columns relate to different various very costly services that the county was providing those individuals. If you look at day 1, when we housed these individuals, you see a dramatic shift in utilization of services. So that's the number 1 goal of the project. There are all, of course, a bunch of other untangible results, like the quality of life of individuals and the quality of the community's life. If you duplicate this on a very large scale, which hopefully someday we'll all be able to do, you can really dramatically impact individual as well as community life. So the project is working in its 2nd year, but it's also full of, and so this is a point I wanted to make here. As a service provider implementing a pay for success project, tons of lessons, but one is outcome-based programming is not static. You know, it's when you're implementing a theory, life happens. And so, or in our case, death. So one of the surprises we've had in this project is the incredible amount of acuity of the clients we're serving. We assumed, I think, do we assume one death a year or about that? And we actually had 9 in the first year. Now, interestingly enough, or actually I think from a values perspective, these were individuals who would have died on the streets, but they actually ended up dying in their own homes. So how do you measure that as a positive outcome? It is obviously a positive outcome. I don't think anyone would argue with this. But so the point, there are many of these examples of what we anticipated and then what really happens in life. The housing market is even more challenging than it was when we started the project, and we've had to adapt how we do our housing intervention. So one of my lessons as an executive of an organization doing this outcomes approach is that you need to be adaptive. That the greatest opportunity provided by an outcomes approach is the lessons learned from what is happening in real time. And if you do that successfully, you will really be able to get at impact over the long haul that really follows what's happening in day-to-day life. The other lesson that I knew early on as we were doing the deal with Santa Clara County is it's all about the quality of your partnership. And not all partners are equal. Just like you've seen one foundation, you've seen one foundation. I would say that's the same for nonprofits and for government. And Santa Clara County has been an incredible partner in this transaction, willing to adapt and improve as we move forward.
Thanks, Louis. I'm going to get folks thinking about questions that you have for our panelists. There's so much here, more so than we're going to be able to cover in the short time that we have. But we're going to turn to Saidah, and then we're going to welcome some questions from the audience. So get those wheels spinning and hands raised for the microphone. Saidah, Fred mentioned a little bit about Project Hope, Hope SF, and the Phoenix collaboration. I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about the economic mobility program and specifically how you're working differently with the city and with the nonprofit providers that you've engaged to collaborate in designing this program.
Sure. So Hope SF at its face is housing and infrastructure, the physical stuff, but at its core is the people. There are real people who live here, and there are real people that we're changing lives for. And I want to echo what Louis said, that if we built the housing, we've spent a lot of money. But if we don't couple the housing with quality services, or we have to couple the housing with quality services in order to reap the benefits of our investment, right? So Amari, I came in contact with Amari when he was 14 years old, straight out of juvenile justice. And prior to my role at the mayor's office, I was in nonprofit work. And I afforded him his first job, or rather he earned his first job. And I worked with him for 2 years. And Amari, when he aged out of the program, he went on to do what he did, and I transitioned myself into the mayor's office. Well, 3 months ago, Amari was killed in a high-speed chase after allegedly committing robbery. So the first thing that came to mind was, what could I have done differently? As his program coordinator, as his supervisor, as his first job, that would have led him in a different direction, that would have put him in post-secondary education, in college or in school or to work, and not put him in that car on that freeway. this is the work that Hope SF is, and this is the work that the Phoenix Project is about. We have, despite a tremendous amount of resources and our best effort, the city has failed the people in these neighborhoods. And now I speak as the city, transitioning from nonprofit to the city, we invested in neighborhoods and in organizations to just do work and not focus on outcomes. So the Phoenix Project is our opportunity to do it differently and to provide those quality services to the young people who need them. We have found in Hope SF that despite the amount of resources going to these neighborhoods, our young people are actually in a downward spiral. So our young people ages 14 to 24 are seeing downward mobility or are stagnant where they are. And we have a responsibility, and I hold myself personally responsible for their upward mobility. As the economic mobility director, that's what that means. That means I connect them to a pathway where they can achieve upward mobility and success. And we're doing that in a collaborative effort. We have entrusted 7 indigenous organizations in the Southeast sector who are rooted in these communities with deep roots, who may not necessarily have the best grant writers or the most profound budget, but do the work. And it's these organizations that actually do the work that we don't tend to celebrate and that we don't tend to collaborate with. But we've been intentional with the Phoenix Project to collaborate with these folks. And I will say that the planning process has been a trying one. Shifting to the outcomes-based model is different. A lot of feedback that we got is, how can the city ask us to shift towards outcomes when the city doesn't even know what outcomes it wants? And they're right, and we couldn't argue with them. But one thing that we reinforce, that Hope SF is reinforcing, is that we're here to do it with you. So we're building the plane as we're flying it. We're currently, the Phoenix Project is currently in its rapid prototyping phase. And we understand that there will be failures and there will be great successes. And our goal is to learn from those challenges and to uplift those challenges. And to begin to create this culture that suggests it's okay for you to fail, but let's figure it out. Let's learn from what we've done wrong and shift. And that's been the biggest challenge for the Phoenix Collaborative, is to shift towards this outcomes-based framework and trust that the city will support them in this, because for too long, orgs have been defunded for not meeting outcomes or for not meeting goals. And this collaborative, we've been in it with them every step of the way. I've been a partner, and they're finally seeing themselves as a partner with the city in this work.
Thank you. Louis and Kavita, I'm going to go off script a little bit here, because I think some of Saidah's, and I should mention that Saidah filled in last minute for Kate Howard, who wasn't able to make it here today, and just came from a youth meeting with some of the youth at Hope SF with the Phoenix Project. So I'm going to ask you, how that's affecting some of their lives. But some of the comments you just made about this trust that's necessary in these new types of partnerships, Louis and Kavita, I've heard you both talk about that in the Pay for Success projects, and I'm hoping you can say a little bit more about what it's felt like to work in these different ways with each other when you've had contracts for many years predicated on outputs, and you're now, the outcome center that we saw in the movie. What has that meant for you individually and for your organizations?
Go ahead.
I find it personally very liberating, but that's not that relevant. That's just my personal. It actually kind of is relevant, because if I don't feel good about things don't happen in my organization. So let's look at staff. I think it takes a while to get used to what I would describe as much more of an adult conversation. Mm-hmm. Because quite frankly, I think we're in a pretty paternalistic, nonprofits are in a paternalistic relationship with government in a lot of cases. And so we have to change the way we're thinking on the nonprofit side, and if government wants us to go to a different place, the sort of trust that you were just describing is really the way there. Because you could just go through nonprofits, throwing them away until you got to someone who wanted to play the game, the outcome game. But that doesn't seem like it's really much of a trusting relationship. So I think that's how I would describe the relationship in Santa Clara. I actually, quite frankly, very much appreciate that the county of Santa Clara really knows what it wants. Because I find often when we contract with government entities, they don't know what they want, and that causes confusion later. So those are two thoughts I have about working with the county and importance of the relationship change.
Yeah, I think from the county's standpoint, kind of right back at you, Louis. I mean, we have loved working with the organization and then also with Telecare Corporation, which is our service provider for our other Pay for Success project. And like you said, the ability to have more of a grown-up adult conversation around what is it that the county's looking for? What is it that you as a service provider can realistically deliver in order to meet the needs of our community which is our mission to serve? How do we achieve together the best route to do that? I wondered if I could just even go off script a little bit from the question and pick up on some threads from what both Louis and Saidah have said around, I think, some of the greatest long-term benefits for government and for service providers and ultimately for the communities we serve of Pay for Success and outcomes focus. I think in Santa Clara County, some of the greatest benefits that we have seen are exactly this kind of partnership between government and service providers. And I think the encouragement of innovation by service providers in not just responding to a solicitation and RFP that lists, here are the 10 things we want you to do and here's how much we're going to pay per hour, but a more open-ended RFP that says, here's the goal we want to achieve and we want you to be creative in telling us how you're going to do it. And then the second thing is thinking creatively as a government organization and also as service providers about, I think maybe a good way to put it is what constitutes an outcome. So something that might traditionally look more like an output could actually be an outcome. And I'll give you an example of what I'm thinking about for both of these threads, one being the innovation by service providers and the other the sort of different outcomes. Santa Clara County's Board of Supervisors made a decision about a month ago to allocate $3.5 million in immediate grant funding to serve individuals who are impacted by the presidential administration's immigration enforcement priorities. So to provide direct immigration legal services to the community as well as Know Your Rights and other education and outreach services. I have been part of the team working on putting that project together, figuring out how best to spend the $3.5 million to make sure that our community is receiving good services. And we received direction from our Board of Supervisors to move away from a block grant style of funding towards a more performance-oriented style of funding. So we issued a solicitation that sought partnership from the service providers in the community, many of whom we regularly work with to fund immigration legal services already, and some of whom we don't, who are kind of the smaller, scrappier, place-based organizations that we don't traditionally fund and maybe don't have the best grant writers, but we know that, hey, you're gonna be serving a community that our traditional providers aren't reaching. And so if our goal is to reach as much of the community as possible and to provide as broad a swath of services as possible, we need to be looking outside of our traditional models. And where I was going with the whole unusual outcomes thing, we were thinking deeply about, particularly with legal services, how do you figure out what's the best outcome for immigration legal services? And because immigration is such a complex area and a difficult system to navigate, winning a case is not necessarily the only thing that's a good outcome. You can provide someone with really good legal services and not win the case in immigration. So what we tried to do is to recommend to our Board of Supervisors that the outcomes focus more on providing people with due process. And that, it's an important legal and constitutional right, but in this context, it's not just about kind of the formality of providing people with due process. But studies actually show in the immigration context that having counsel or not makes a difference in whether people prevail in receiving immigration relief, to the tune of, if they don't have counsel, it's 5, 10, 15% of people prevail. With counsel, 75, 80%. So having outcomes that focus on things like how many immigration hearings are you appearing at on behalf of clients? How many relief applications are you submitting? Those things sound like outputs, but they're not. In this context, they really are outcomes.
Thanks, Kavita. Before we jump into questions, Saidah, I'd love to just hear, you mentioned that you're flying the plane as you build it, and I'd love to hear what that means for the residents that you're working with, because you're not just collaborating with the providers. Part of the project, as I understand it, is to really engage the residents in the type of services and supports that they feel they need and the outcomes they're looking to achieve. So would love to hear how that's going as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, so as I mentioned, the Phoenix Collaborative, as they were going through their planning process, the residents, I mean, we're definitely at the forefront. I'm young, but not young. I'm not 14 or 24, and neither are the executive directors at the collaborative. So it was definitely important to have their input and their feedback. And we know that as organizations and as service providers and as the city, we're not perfect. So we definitely want to foster these young leaders, these champions, as we identify them, to build this program that's meant to benefit them. What do they want to see? What outcomes do they think are necessary for them to reach? Where can we be of most help? I mean, just because the city wants more people to go to work doesn't mean a young person wants to go to work. School may be their best option, or vocational training. I think too often or too frequently we've made decisions for people without having those people who we think it will benefit at the table, which is what we've done wrong and where Hope SF is trying to correct, and which is why we involve residents at every step of the way. I mean, the residents should definitely be in this seat. So yeah, they are definitely a big part of the planning process. I was with a group of 12 young adults this morning before I came here who are contributing to the planning process and contributing to the rapid prototype phase for the Phoenix project. And we don't know where we're going to land. We just know we want to land safely.
Great perspective. Questions from the audience? I see one up front here.
Good afternoon. My name is Ivy Williams, East Oakland resident. So my question is for both Abode and Santa Clara County. So one of my biggest concerns is oftentimes residents aren't a part of the decision-making process. Understandably, sometimes just the capacity is not there. We understand that. But during creating outcomes, how can we include residents in more of, I guess you would say, a participatory manner so that they can at least have an understanding of what's going on, because oftentimes they best know what's going on in their community. So,
For the sake of the folks on the live stream, we've been asked to repeat the audience question, so I'm just going to try to summarize that. The question is really around how do we do a better job of engaging residents in defining and describing the outcomes that we're working towards? And I think Louis and Kavita.
Yeah, I'll start. Very important. And we refer to our program participants as partners. So language is really important. We, particularly in the front end now, we're always trying to incorporate peer leadership on the team. So they're actually embedded in the team, even if it's a clinical team, so that there's not this sense of us and them. There's not these third-person sort of conversations that can happen amongst professionals. We don't talk about people as their diagnosis, for example. We talk about people as people and with names and so forth. These seem like small things, but they're really important. I think in terms of the broader system, advocacy is probably where the future is. I'm really encouraged to hear today several of the foundations focusing on empowering low-income people in displaced communities, empowering them through organization to have their voice heard. I think that's the other element, but that's how we approach it.
The idea of involving clients or consumers in program design is something I wrote down in caps with a big star by it while Saidah was talking, as something that I think we have some work to do. At Santa Clara County, we have a number of county boards and commissions that involve representatives from the communities that the Board or Commission is trying to serve. So, for example, an intimate partner violence task force that includes survivors of domestic violence, a joint foster youth task force that includes foster youth, so that representatives of those communities can be involved in making larger county policy decisions that impact their own group. We have not, to my knowledge, done that in such a concrete way in the pay for success space or in the outcomes-based contracting space, but I think it's something that, for the reasons that others have highlighted, is critical. And I can think of with the immigration contracts that I was describing, there could be real value in a contract like that where services aren't being provided sort of for the county's benefit, but really for the direct benefit of the community. In hearing a community voice around what types of services would be most valuable, where physically, where geographically should they be located, things like that.
Saidah, I don't want to put you on the spot, but given that you are doing some of this work with the residents, I'm curious if you have some other thoughts on, what are some of the most successful strategies that you have for engagement, and where have you had some challenges perhaps as well?
There are the successes and challenges. I would say one of the biggest challenges is, and what I would caution folks, is when we say we want to bring residents to the table, identifying our poster residents and having that represent the whole, right? And then on the other end of the spectrum is surveying everyone. And I cannot get enough feedback that people hate being surveyed. And that doesn't work. But it's really getting into the community and having a team that's representative and reflective of the community. Although I am not a Hope SF resident, I have family that lives in Hope SF. I hung out at Hope SF sites, and I am a former public housing resident, a product of Hope 6. So it's really being in the community, being a continuous voice, and building the trust and relationship. I mean, that's the most I can say is building trust, because very easily working for the city of San Francisco, we can be looked at as the man or the system. But getting out there frequently and going to see the folks and just having candid conversations, not let me give you this paper, check the box, and then we'll tell you what we're going to do with it a year later, but just having conversation.
Community organizing.
Yeah, and being action oriented too,
right.
Doing action after that information is received.
Other questions? Yes, in the back.
Oh, hi. My name is Richard Rosman, and I represent me in this Pay for Success program, which is really great. Where is the educational system? I'm from LA, and there's been 4 generations lost in the inner city when you have 40 and 50 and 60% dropout rates, and everybody just sort of turns their head. I know Oakland is challenged. Other places are challenged. Are you going to be able to get the school systems on board to bring out better product coming out so that the homeless situation, maybe there's more education opportunities and there's more job availability, rather than a high school dropout ends up in a homeless situation and it sort of just goes in a circle?
I'm happy to start with some of that, and Kavita and Louis, maybe you all can fill in. I think one of the challenges with Pay for Success as a particular financing mechanism is the fact that you are asking investors to pay for outcomes. And this is a new way of doing business with investors to begin with. To ask them to pay for outcomes that are 18 years down the line might be unrealistic at this point for, I think, a lot of folks that we've spoken with. But you are seeing Pay for Success projects start to focus on early childhood projects, things that look at shorter term objectives that get us towards those longer term goals that you've spoken of, where really we understand that the type of education and creating better outcomes for youth does in fact lead to better cycles for all of the folks that we've talked about. But it has to be broken down into smaller pieces. I'm curious, Kavita, if you perhaps have anything to add from the government side.
Having been less closely involved at our county on the project in which Louis is the leader of the service provider, I don't know that I have a ton to add. I would say that I think, as you're describing, the challenge around paying for those very, very, very long-term outcomes is kind of an ongoing challenge with Pay for Success. And I think one of the ways in our county that we've tried to bridge that gap is by focusing on projects. So we, as part of our initial Pay for Success exploration, worked with a consultant to do feasibility assessment around a number of different areas in which Pay for Success could be of value to our county. So kind of trying to balance out both observable short-term and long-term outcomes that make the project have some really satisfying successes in the beginning, but then also the long-term outcomes that you want to see for your clients.
Mm-hmm. Great. Others in the room?
Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm Sherry Williams from the Treasure Island Homeless Development Initiative, and we certainly have been working towards doing more outcomes-based programming, but one of the challenges or hurdles, I would say, is just the administrative, so the sophisticated administrative infrastructure you really need to do that, and I'm just curious as to what you all had to develop, everything from advanced technology to databases to having the staff that manages all that, because our experience is that funders, while they still want the outcomes, they're really more interested in having the services and don't want to necessarily fund all of those costs associated with that more sophisticated administrative work that's required to really show those outcomes. So just kind of curious about your experience.
I'm just going to repeat one for the sake of the live stream, folks. The question is really about how nonprofits and governments as well have invested in the technology, the data systems, the infrastructure necessary to track, measure, improve outcomes.
So that's the million-dollar question. I think for nonprofits, if you're going to give more, you got to get more. We need to become much more sophisticated in our negotiation skills, quite frankly. And so, but I think it's possible. I believe it now because we've done a number of these transactions, not just Pay for Success, where, quite frankly, what's happened with Pay for Success for my organization is now the dynamics change. We don't seek out funding. People are coming to us to do work in their communities. And that means that I can engage that entity in a conversation about what's necessary for me to be successful. And I learned how to do that through Pay for Success because I was asked from the beginning, what do you need to be successful? Not, what could you live with? Okay, that's the difference. And the foundations who get this core general support unrestricted truth are an incredibly important part of that dynamic because a little truth is government has trouble paying for some things because they have a political process they have to go through. And so often what I see with foundations is a foundation can come in around core support and provide that support, which is leveraged by massive impact that the government is going to put into a particular project. So I think it is doable, but that is the task of nonprofit leadership as we move into outcomes-based contracting.
I want to emphasize the rapid prototyping phase. And your question is exactly where the Phoenix project is now, figuring out what's the right system because there are a million systems that exist and none of them talk to each other. And then the city systems don't talk to the city systems. So right now we've went back to the basics. We've started with Google Forms and Google Docs in hopes of learning what it is we need to track, learning what outcomes we need to measure, what it can collect, what it can't, and then identifying the appropriate system. But Louis is absolutely right. It's literally the million-dollar question and why the learn as you go phase is so important.
So in Santa Clara County, it's literally $1 million question right now. We just executed a $1.5 million contract with a group called Palantir Technologies that many people are probably familiar with that's allowing us to overcome some of these barriers around antiquated government data systems and achieve exactly the things Saidah is talking about with collecting a bunch of disparate data sources, criminal justice data, health data, substance abuse service data, mental health service data, exactly, and produce results like this where you get all the data systems talking to one another. You have the ability to triage clients to identify, okay, you have eligibility for clients for a particular project where they need to have a certain level of service utilization across sectors. Well, how do you figure out if the person who's identified in the criminal justice system is the same individual who also entered the emergency room 3 weeks ago? Well, you spend $1.5 million to have a group like Palantir do that work. And I think that the conclusion, I can't speak for the County Board of Supervisors, but the conclusion that, I've drawn from the statements they've made is it would be penny wise and pound foolish to not spend that money now to achieve the long-term outcomes that we as a government organization really need to see.
We have just a few more minutes, so in closing, I'd love to hear from each of you. What's exciting you about this work right now? What's challenging you? What's keeping you up at night about this process? Because we're not at the starting gate for many of you, not at the starting gate, though you are all trailblazers. Being a few yards past start, what do you see now that you perhaps didn't see, and what advice do you have for others in the room?
I think we've all touched on that in the responses that we've given, but one thing that I'm thinking about right now is the fact that executing a contract and launching a pay-for-success project isn't the end of the story. You have a 6-year contract. As Louis mentioned earlier, part of the process of, or part of sort of what you're getting into with the pay-for-success project is an ongoing commitment to a 6-year partnership. To have the willingness to have those hard conversations around, okay, we've received our first quarter of data, looking at the enrollment numbers or client service utilization numbers, and maybe they're not where we thought they would be. Maybe they're better, maybe they're worse. Are there any adjustments that we need to make to our course so that the remaining 5.5 years of the project look the way that we want them to look? On our mental health project, we're still working on executing our agreement with our independent evaluator. There are just bumps in the road that you have to navigate and know that pay for success, when you start one, you're really in it for the long haul.
That's very true. An incredible amount of work, but again, it's all, the sweet nectar of this work is the learning from it. I put that. The other thing that excites me about outcomes, impact, focus, contracting is that my team gets to celebrate, 6,200 people housed in 7 years. We get to celebrate that as opposed to when I started with the organization. Well, we sheltered 500 people this year. And so that's what really gets me up and our team up in the morning. And we know all the stories behind that. The team does as well. Mm-hmm. I think though we need to, and this I'll just leave with this, I think we need to have an honest conversation, not here today, but for the future. I'll just leave this. For those of us who really want to see this happen, about the barriers and the resistance that this change brings with it. Both in the nonprofit sector, which is a different sort of set of barriers and resistance, and in government. We work in 5 counties now. Not everyone's equal, I can tell you that. There are counties where we are reducing our work because they're not in that space, and we just want to go to a space where we're much more outcome oriented. So those are my thoughts.
And I'm excited for the partnership. I think we're at a point, this is a prime time to get it right, to focus on delivering quality services to the people who deserve it, to focus on celebrating the organizations who have been doing the work for decades and haven't been recognized for the work that they're doing. And then being partners with the city, with our philanthropic partners, and building their capacity, which is most important. We want to celebrate the people, and we also want to celebrate the organizations working with the people. So that's what I'm most excited about. I can say I've had several dreams about data because coming from the nonprofit world, all you know is enter the data, but to think about outcomes and graphics and charts and different colors is really exciting to me, because when things change colors, you know you're moving the needle in this outcomes-based world, and I always look forward to changing colors.
Thank you, Saidah. Thank you all for sharing your stories and for the work you're doing.